So hello, welcome to SeniorFlix. My name is David Wise, and today I'm interviewing Reverend Tony Baker. Tony's had an interesting life, I know, and continues to have an interesting life. So Tony, tell us a bit about yourself. So where were you born? And
well, you know, I don't really remember being born, but I know they tell me I was born in a place called Leicester in England.
Leicester, yeah.
Yeah, it was in the middle of the Second World War.
Yeah.
My father was a U.S. military man, but he joined the British Navy because the U.S. wasn't in the war at that time, and he was serving in the British Navy. He met my mother in the U.K. and they married, and I was the production of that marriage.
Yeah.
Shortly after I was born, my father went back to sea and his ship was torpedoed and lost off the coast of Newfoundland, so I never knew my father.
Wow.
That kind of left me in somewhat of a stateless position. My father's family were all from Illinois, so I was alone in England. My mother suffered now as a widow, and she eventually remarried, and the man she remarried was a terrible man. He abused me terribly,
Really?
abused my mother. And life for me as a young boy was just a tragic life. I was very afraid, a timid little boy, couldn't connect with anybody. The only respite I had my maternal grandparents, especially my maternal grandfather. He was a man that loved me without question. And every time I could spend time with him, it was just so wonderful. I loved being with him. His name was Gordon. And man, that man was put in my life, I'm sure, by God to take care of the love that I needed. As I was growing up, my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, Gordon and his wife, they moved to North Carolina to be with my aunt, who had married a GI, as a matter of fact, during the war. She married a GI,
Okay.
took her off to America.
Yeah.
So now I've lost them. My paternal grandfather from Illinois, he came to visit once while I was in England, and I remember sitting on his lap, and he loved me. I could see that.
Yeah.
And later on, as I grew up, my father's brother, my uncle, came to visit. What a great guy he was. And so my heart was always in America. My roots were American. My heart was there. My grandfather was there. Both grandfathers. The one that loved me was there. And England, as I grew up, it just didn't have much for me. I said an abusive childhood, a very dysfunctional family.
Yeah. So you spent your early years in England. You went to school there and you worked there, Tony, did you?
Yeah, I went to school, parochial school. It was a Catholic family, and so I went to a Catholic school where I had to learn all the catechism and all the stuff that Catholics have to learn.
Yes.
And I remember that I went to live with an old aunt, an aunt of my father, who was living in England at the time. And she would take me to Mass every Sunday. And I became an altar boy, learned the Latin Mass and all that kind of stuff. And then as I grew up, I would go to church on a Sunday morning with my dysfunctional family. And my stepfather, he would leave church and go off to the pub and get drunk and come home and beat me and my mother. And just a terrible situation.
Yeah. Wow.
As soon as I could, I escaped from home. And I got a job on the Coventry City Police Department. I became a police officer.
Okay.
I never thought I'd do that. But
So what sort of age were you then?
I was 19.
You were 19 then.
Joined
Yeah.
the Coventry City Police.
Yeah.
And I had a wonderful time. And during the police, my experience was I walked the beat, rode a bicycle. We didn't have motorcycles back then.
Right.
That was a fun time.
Yeah.
An interesting thing, while I was on the police department, at that time the police department was pretty well all white.
Yeah.
And Coventry City Police broke the barrier of race, and they hired the very first non-white person. He was an Indian guy, and I think his name was Mo. And I became Mo's training officer. So I walked around town with Mo on my beat, and the press were there taking pictures and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So that was quite an experience, you know, training the very first non-white police officer. Of course, he was a man just the same as anybody else, and it was a wonderful time.
So now you were single at the time when
I was.
Yeah. And then.
Well, then when I was, I guess 20, I met Margaret, and we were courting, and we got married right away. I was 21 when I got married. That's what you did those days. You just got married early, and off you went, and then a year later, our first son was born.
Yeah.
But I always had this itching to go to America.
Yeah.
To be with my real family.
You had very warm feelings about the U.S. based on your relationship with your
and very
relatives.
Bad feelings about England.
Yeah.
I'd grow that dysfunctional situation. So.
Yeah.
But the problem was, when my father died, my mother had nothing to prove who he was. Didn't have his birth certificate, his passport, or anything like that. So I couldn't. I tried to apply to go to America, but because I couldn't prove that I was an American citizen by birth, because I didn't have my father's stuff, I couldn't do it. So the opportunity came. One of my colleagues from Coventry went to Canada and joined the police department. He said, they're hiring. So I applied. Sure enough, I got called and said, come on over, we'll hire you.
Yeah.
I was 23 at the time.
Okay. So Canada was your number 2 choice. That wasn't your...
It was my number 2.
Well, I think you can be forgiven for that probably, Tony, but anyway.
But I'm glad it worked out the way it did, because I'm so blessed to have been in Canada. So I came, flew over. I quit the police department in Coventry on a Friday, got on the airplane on a Saturday, arrived in Canada on a Saturday, went to police headquarters the following Tuesday, and was hired immediately.
In Toronto?
In Toronto.
Yeah. Oh, really?
So I was very fortunate. It's a funny thing, to get hired, there was a physical standard. You had to be 5'10", and 160 pounds. I was 5'11", and 140 pounds. I was skinny as a rail.
Yeah.
So when I went for my test, I drank a gallon of water to add 10 pounds.
To get up to the
And
weight.
I still barely made it.
Yeah.
And while I'm doing my interview and when I'm doing my medical, I'm rushing off to the bathroom because that gallon of water is making its way out, you know. So,
okay. So, so that was your start in the police force in Canada, in Toronto.
Yes.
So then then you continued in the police force for?
I did. I served in the Toronto Police. First of all, I was walking the beat. Then I moved into the traffic department and rode a motorcycle for many years. So I was a professional motorcyclist. I later got promoted several times. I became a detective, a sergeant, a staff sergeant in charge of the station. I got promoted to a senior officer rank, so I was very fortunate to get promoted many, many times. And by the time I retired, which is in 1997, I had reached the rank of staff inspector, which is almost like a major or a colonel in the military. And when I retired, I was in charge of a unit of 300 people, so I was a unit commander.
So during your time in Canada, or in Toronto then, you must have had some interesting assignments here in the police, as a police officer.
Things. Yeah, amazing. And growing up in a multicultural city of Toronto, it was wonderful. I got to meet people from all different cultures. I loved it because as I met them, I'm trying to find out where they're from, and I start to learn some of the little languages, the little clips. I'm gifted in languages, which is very fortunate.
Yes.
So I was able to learn. I met with so many different people. As a police officer, you meet with the lowest of the low, the poor street people that have nothing,
Yes.
and the highest of the high, prime ministers. I even met Princess Diana at one time.
Oh, really?
She came to Toronto for a visit, and I was the inspector in charge of 13 Division at the time, which is over St. Clair and Spadina area.
Yeah.
And she was visiting a restaurant there, so I was there to help her out of the car and take her inside the restaurant.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was quite the thing.
Really, yeah. And yeah, so that was a big responsibility then, that sort of security
Yep.
thing. And then,
Well, another security thing I did, Billy Graham had a crusade at the Sky Dome one time.
yes,
And I was in charge of all security for the Sky Dome when he came in. So, and I had to make sure, and I actually met Billy Graham. What a wonderful man he was.
really, yeah,
When I think of the most heroic people in my lifetime, and great respect, that was a man I have respected so
Yeah,
much. A
yeah.
tremendous man,
yeah,
a great faith. I had no faith at that. I had very little faith at that time.
yeah,
I grew up, I walked away from the church. When I left home, I left the church.
yeah,
Because it meant nothing to me.
yeah,
It was very dogmatic, and
yeah.
it did nothing for me. And I was a wandering
Yeah.
sinner.
So a person like Billy Graham, he must have had some influence in your life, in your thinking.
Well, he
Tony,
did,
and-
because I'd seen him on television. I'd heard about him.
Yeah.
And I was a Christian by the time I went to this crusade.
Yes.
So I became a Christian because my mother had some other children, some step siblings. And one of them was my brother Terry. I call him my brother because he's like a brother, and he's my half brother. And Terry was a software engineer, not a software, a petrochemical engineer.
yes,
And he traveled all around the world. He was very successful, had lots of money. He had several cars. He had a house in London, a house in somewhere else, and a woman at every port. He was that type of guy. I
Yeah.
loved Terry.
yeah,
And I remember once we heard that he was in Australia and he got saved. Well, we thought, oh, the Moonies have got him. You know, what's happened
yes,
to Terry?
yeah, yeah,
Because then he ups and quits his engineering program
yeah,
and he goes to Bible school.
Yeah.
Oh, what?
Yeah.
So we couldn't understand this. The whole family were talking about what's happened to Terry.
Yes.
It's the Moonies. You know, he's
Yeah.
got.
yeah,
Anyway, he came to visit me in Toronto one time, and he was on a sabbatical. No, he was doing an internship in Vancouver, and he was telling me that, Tony, you'll be a Christian soon. I says, really? How do you know that? He says, because God told me. I says, come on, how do you know? I know, you're going to be a Christian.
yeah,
Well, tell me about it. So he's
Yeah.
telling me all about the resurrection and the
Yeah.
truth of the gospel.
yeah,
And it's at the time I was working on the department, I was a detective, and my partner at the time was a closet Christian. He didn't announce his Christianity, but there
Right.
was something different about it. His name was Mo Robinson. And Mo, I was telling Mo about my brother coming to visit. He says, well, that's strange. My brother was an engineer and he quit to become a pastor. And my brother's actually in town. Why don't we come and meet your brother? So Mo and his brother came to my house to meet me and my brother.
yes,
And there I am with the three of them
yes,
telling me all about Christianity.
yes,
And that night I went to bed and I didn't sleep. The next morning I got up, drove into the office, parked my car in an underground, started to walk up the steps, and I couldn't go any further. I knelt down. Lord, I know I'm a sinner. I know, and I know that you died for me.
amazing.
Would you accept me?
Yeah,
And that moment I stood up, I walked out of the underground, the sun was shining brighter than it's ever shone in it,
yeah,
and I was floating 3 feet off the ground.
yeah,
I became a Christian.
amazing, amazing,
It
wonderful.
was a tremendous experience.
Yes, yeah. And so, and so then you retired. You said in '97.
I retired in '97, and
then-
I'm very fidgeted. I have difficulty standing still or sitting still. You notice I'm fidgety here even, because that's my nature. I'm always on the go. And so we're going to church. Margaret's going to church with me, and we're sitting in church one day, And she says, you need to do something. And she says, why don't you go to Bible college? Well, really? Yeah, you like to study. Well, I do like to study. I'm an academic at heart. And
Yeah.
so I applied, and I got accepted at Tyndale Seminary.
Yeah.
Because before that, I'd been to school a lot. I'd been to University of Toronto, so I got a degree from there. And so I went into Tyndale
Yeah.
and earned my Master of Divinity.
And you were 50 or 60 years old at that time.
I was 54.
54, yes, yeah.
I got my Master of Divinity.
Yeah,
And then I got hired at Agincourt Pentecostal Church, just up here on Kennedy,
really, yeah,
as a pastor.
yeah. Well, that's an amazing story. I think we need to sort of wrap it up here now, Tony. I think we've run out of time, unfortunately. But obviously, you've got a lot more of a story to tell. I think we'll have to come back again another day if they'll have us here.
I'll see.
I should have mentioned at the introduction that you are currently pastor here at Shepherd Village.
Yes.
And taking care of things here and doing just a wonderful job that I can attest to, seeing you every Sunday by the grace of God. That's wonderful, Tony, and we so appreciate you being here and telling us so far your story, and so on behalf of SeniorFlix, I want to say thank you, and we'll look forward to talking again soon.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
My pleasure.
Okay, bye.